Hello YouTube, it's great to be back. I've had to take a bit of a hiatus. Unfortunately, childcare fell through for me and I had nobody to watch my daughter except for me. So I didn't really have time to put towards art or making videos or pretty much anything else. However, recently that has been resolved. I now have some childcare, so although I won't have a full-time schedule, I will still have enough time to work on projects and make videos. I'm probably only going to be doing one video per week again, but that is mostly because I have some big projects in the works that I'm very excited about. I'm going to be launching a comic, 2 comics actually. The first one is a practice comic. I've never made a comic before, so I wanted to make sure that I could work out how to do it before I get to my main comic, which is a project I am very, very excited about. So the first comic that I'm working on, I did want a just short, simple comic just so that I can kind of go through all of the motions of getting a comic set up and figure out what I need to know during the process. I chose a fairy tale because it is public domain, so I didn't have to worry so much about the writing part, and I could just focus on the actual process rather than the writing. And I chose Little Red Riding Hood because it is one of my favorites of all time. So for today's video, I just wanted to go over my process thus far as getting the script set up and doing the thumbnails for the comic. What I did to start with is I got the 2 main original versions of Little Red Riding Hood, which is the Grimm Brothers and Perrault. Perrault, I believe, is credited with the very first time that the actual Little Red Riding Hood story was ever written down, and then the Grimm Brothers is kind of a retelling of that, their own version. I ended up mostly going with the Grimm Brothers with some minor modifications, a little bit from the Perrault version and a little bit of my own just to kind of fit more with the story that I wanted to tell. Very minor changes though. So it is primarily just the original Brothers Grimm fairy tale. After I did all of the tweaks to the story that I wanted and I had the actual story that I wanted to tell, I went through and I broke it down into pages. So I just grouped what I thought kind of fit together on one page and then kind of went along breaking it up. What I wanted to think about is not only what fit together, what needed to be told together as part of the story, but also where did you want the page to end? Where do you want the reader to be able to turn the page? So that's mostly what I was thinking about while I was dividing it up. That, and also, of course, the spacing on the page. How much story can you fit on one page? I didn't want it to feel cramped. I wanted it to be able to breathe a little bit, but at the same time, I didn't want a really long comic. So that's kind of what I was thinking about as I was making these. After I had it roughly divided into what pages I wanted, I went and made actual page scripts. I didn't really look up how to make comic page scripts or see other people's page scripts. This is just what makes sense to me. But basically, I took that little section of what story is going on what page and I broke it up into panels. So part of it was I knew I didn't want any more than 8 panels per page, preferring to stick more around 6, maybe less. As I was breaking it up into the different pages, I also made sure I had a good idea of what images I wanted to represent each part of the story. So then as I'm writing the page script, I kind of already know, well, here in this one he's saying this, so I want a panel and it's gonna, be a shot of him doing this while he's saying that, sort of thing, as I'm going. I did kind of have a small idea in some areas about what size or shape I wanted the panel to be, but mostly at this stage they were just kind of rough images in my head. There actually was a couple places where I didn't even have a real clear idea of what image I was going to use, just that I knew I wanted that particular part to be a panel. So then moving on, once I had all of the page scripts done, and it came out to be 20 pages, which I thought was a really good size for my short practice comic. Next was the thumbnails. Because I decided to do this comic digitally, I'm actually doing the thumbnails directly onto the files that I plan on using for the actual pages. It didn't really seem necessary to create separate files, so I'm doing the thumbnails directly onto what is going to eventually be the finished page. Just real quick, if you want to know the specs that I'm using, because I know that American comics tend to use a 2:3 ratio with a 10:15 size, I think, being the standard. That's the size that I'm using for my comic pages. They are 10:15 inches at 600 dpi. Normally people would use 300 dpi, but I use 600 dpi just in case I really like the way a panel turns out and I want to have the option to make it a print or have it as a background wallpaper or something along those lines. I'm not using any bleed or trim borders. I believe it's just 1/4 of an inch that I sectioned off around the edges, because it being my first comic and not knowing what sort of printing system I'm going to use, I decided it would be a lot simpler for me to not even worry about bleed. So by making sure that all of my images are safely within the panels and not going to be full bleed, I can always add more border around the edges so that it can fit whatever template I need in order to be able to print it later. I also kept what little border I have now small because I do plan on putting this online, so I wanted it to be really easy to read on the phone, and I didn't want a lot of blank space around the edges so that it would be larger. So sadly, I don't have a lot of footage of me actually figuring out how I want the panels laid out. It's honestly just a lot of me sitting there staring at the computer screen or staring at my page scripts, trying to piece it together in my mind. But basically what it is I look at the images that I have noted in my script about what I want to happen. I'm looking at what the images that I want are and trying to figure out what the best size and shape for each kind of image is to convey the message that I want to convey in that panel, and then kind of fitting them together. What helped me most is I was mostly working in rows. So for example, I would say panel 1 and panel 2 work really well together, so I want them to be next to each other in the same row, but then panel 3 kind of feels like it needs its own row or something like that. That's mostly how I did it. There were a couple of times where I would actually have to sketch it out first before I had a really good idea of how I actually wanted it. Or there were times where I thought I knew what I wanted, but then I had to go back and change it because it didn't actually work quite as well as I thought it would. But for the most part, the order that I went in was to lay out my panel using guidelines to mark where I wanted it, and then using the brush with the snap feature to actually draw out the panels. Then I would use the magic wand tool to select the interior of the panels, and then I used the select tools to expand it a little bit and then inverse the selection, and then alt delete to fill in the area with black. Because for this particular comic, I decided it would be best if I had black gutters instead of white. Interesting note about the color palette for this comic. It is going to be done entirely in reds, greens, and then grayscale plus black and white. Because it is Little Red Riding Hood and she's in the forest for most of the time, I thought focusing on the contrast of the red and green would be really good, and I'm really excited about the way it's looking. You'll be able to see a little bit more of that in my next video, which has some character design in it. So anyways, after I kind of figured out where I wanted the panels to be, then I would put the text in, because you want to make sure that you know where the text is going to be able to fit into the panel. Because if you draw the picture first and then you try to put the text in after, you run the risk of covering up the picture, and I didn't want that. So most of the time I put the text in first, so I knew kind of where it was going to go. That way I could sketch around it so that everything worked together. Quick note about text: when you're doing speech bubbles, you want to keep in mind kind of what shape you're going to go for with the speech bubbles. I typically like the rounder is better idea, so I try to squish the text so that it would fit as much into a circle or oval as it can. Anyways, so after the text, then I would put in the sketches. Now, because these are just thumbnails, the sketches are extremely loose and messy. They're not there to be pretty and look good. These aren't going to be the finished product. These are just there to tell me what is going to be the final picture in that panel, so that I can have an overview of what the page is going to look like and make sure that everything flows and makes sense. So you don't have to spend a lot of time making it look all pretty, because this isn't what your reader is eventually going to see. Generally speaking, obviously you guys are seeing this now. Now, of course, as I was doing this, different pages, I had a different process. Sometimes I did the sketch first, even before the panels, before the text or any of it, just because I wasn't really sure what I wanted and I needed to play around with it for a little bit. So whatever works best for you in trying to figure out what the layout is. But I do recommend making sure, again, that you include the text in sometime during the sketching process so you can know how to work around it. The most important thing to note when you're doing these sketches, because they can be really loose and really rough, is you want to make sure that you know who the characters are. So if you're drawing like little stick figures or whatever, you want some kind of way of knowing who it is that's in the picture. For example, Red has these 2 strands of hair on the sides of her head, as well as her hood. And so that was almost always included in sketches of Red, so I know who it is that I'm looking at. The wolf has a snout and ears, obviously, so those are included in most of his pictures. You want to know any important details like facial expressions, especially with close-ups. So you want to make sure that you have a basic idea of what the facial expression is supposed to be. Poses can be very important. Which way is the character facing? What are they doing with their hands, etc. Make sure that that stays continuous from panel to panel. For example, in a lot of these, Red is holding the basket in her right arm. And so I have to make sure that in the next panel, whatever, she's still got it in her right arm. It doesn't magically switch arms or disappear or something. Other important details might be specific background details you want. Make sure you make note of those. If your panel has special lighting, make note of that. It doesn't always have to be done in the sketch. You can write little notes. I do that as well. So just make sure that you know what's important and make sure it's present in your sketch so that when you go back to do the actual drawings, you're not missing it. Now, in order to see all of these pages together, what's really nice is I was just saving them all together in the same folder. And then when I go back into that folder, as you can see, they have these preview thumbnails. So you can see the whole comic's thumbnails all together, and make sure that it all flows together that way. So in this video, I showed you thumbnails for the first 10 pages of Little Red Riding Hood. I am finished with the thumbnails for all 20 pages at this point. I'm ready to start working on actually drawing the pages this next week. The comic should actually be launching online for you guys to read in August, so you guys can check that out. I will make sure to post a video when that happens. Next week's video is actually going to be on character design, where I do show Red Riding Hood, the big bad wolf, and I also include a bit of character design for my main character and my other comic that I'm going to be working on, which is called Crystal Dream Princess. So you'll get a sneak peek of the main character in next week's video for that as well. Crystal Dream Princess is due to launch in December of this year. I know it's quite a far way away, but again, I have this Little Red Riding Hood comic that I want to launch beforehand because I really want to make sure that CDP is the best that it can be. It is a project very near and dear to my heart. For those of you wondering what it might be about, Crystal Dream Princess is actually a fantasy horror story, sort of The Labyrinth meets Silent Hill with a little bit of Sailor Moon thrown in. So I'm very excited about that. I will talk about it a little bit more during next week's video when I show her character design. But thank you all so much for watching. For those of you who are still subscribed to me, thank you so much for your patience and waiting for me to come back. I really appreciate it. As always, likes, subscribes, and especially comments are all very much appreciated. I love hearing feedback from you, so please do comment, and I will see you guys next week.